Hello everyone, and quite a few people still coming in, so give everybody time to settle in.
I spoke to Rob earlier when we went to a customer, but early in the week about the novelty conversation. Was it a week or 2 or 3 ago?
Yeah.
Oh gosh, I want to see that recording again. It was so good, so relevant.
Yeah, I know. I mean, that's the whole thing, though. It's the last frontier of happiness, because if you can think of, imagine that you only ever had an opportunity to listen to one song for the rest of your life, or wear one piece of clothing, or drive one kind of car, or use one bit of electronics, or watch one kind of movie. So novelty is so embedded in how your recommendation systems and everything need to connect with your community, and most people see it as a sideline.
Yeah.
And yet is the essence of the ability not to always remember all the things that people have done previously. You actually want a forgetfulness function.
But
you want an amnesia. There's a setting for amnesia.
So Jay, I can neither confirm or deny. That's why I broke up with my girlfriend a week later. But anyway.
Oh, that's it. You said not enough novelty. Yeah,
Yeah, we should embed these algorithms in dating sites.
Oh, exactly. That's a good idea. Actually, we should think about that.
Yeah.
But you know what? But that's the whole thing around, should you date somebody that is...
No. Oh, sorry. The question's not done yet. Sorry. Go on.
Well, let's do it. Hypothetically speaking, should you connect or be with anybody that is exactly like you? And I think that the challenge is that you want somebody that is nothing like you. So that if you're going to have a disagreement, both of you can declare that you are wrong without anybody always wanting to be right. Because if you have people that are exactly the same, one is always going to be better at some discipline or something in a field that you're in, and it creates confusion. So you don't want to be so different that if you fight, you get a neutral ground to say, well, I'm done with this now.
I need whiskey for this, but I'll wait another hour. It's still early-ish. No, that was a great session. Jay, I missed 1 or 2 others, but that was fantastic. It really was.
Excellent. No, that's great. But we'll see today, because I mean, the idea is that I think your recommendation works well. So we're going to show you what we've been working on in creating a series of patterns or templates, whatever, in our recommend module set. And it might be worthwhile to kind of give the headlines on how we've separated some of the recommenders we've configured, and we've got a whole lot more that are in production that we will bring in at some point to show just the scope of this discipline, because it is so broad. I mean, it is so incredibly wide. You can't just, say that there is one way of engaging, and yet there are people or companies who engage with their customers or their clients or their consumers without any recommendation or anything that you get to know about them, or any willingness to learn about what they do and how they do it and when they do it. So, yeah, it's an intriguing topic.
Recommenders. Every day we're surrounded by recommenders. Back in the day, people walking down certain adverts, certain very highly emotionally charged adverts got you to buy certain products. And that was, one way that people were recommending products. And so it's evolved to the point of what we're trying to do in the digital space, or what people are trying to do in the digital space, is almost have a segment of one, so that recommendation is focused on the person and why they are wanting to interact and get a recommendation. So that's why we say build the right recommendation, because you've got the power to do these things. But a lot of the times people don't quite grasp what you can do, what it takes in the background to do it. You might think it's easy to just, let's just segment everybody by their name. Why? How's that going to influence the recommendation? At the first point. And the second is, once you've done one recommendation, that is static. That doesn't lend people to engage. And one of the philosophies that we follow is making sure that engagement is true and beneficial for both parties, and to continue that engagement so people can feel part of something. So that's just kind of some of the leading background from our side, from the business side. I'll let Jay and Eric kind of give a little more intro into what buyer recommenders and what recommenders, and then probably get into a little bit of what we've been doing over the last couple of weeks.
Eric, can I recommend something? Can I show you guys something that I just been through a whole bunch of workshops in the last 2 weeks with clients and fairly sizable groups of people across different lines of business. And what struck me was that people don't have a clear view as to how they would separate consumers from customers from clients. It doesn't seem that there's a common understanding as to what these differences are and why they are different, and how you would drive your engagement through recommendations. So if I can share this with you, it's hand-drawn, it's pretty rough, so you can just bear with me. This is what we're going to discuss in the workshop, and let me just give you a quick glimpse of what the thinking is. You got these 3 pillars. On the left, you got what's known as a consumer, and a consumer is somebody, if you had to look at kind of Noam Chomsky's view of the world, is that you got a thing called the mindless consumer that essentially gets programmed by brand-based marketing and the fact that you are fundamentally disconnected from the people or the company that makes the product that you are engaging with. So that means that if you think about the top line being interaction that run across the top of this chart, if you're a consumer, the interaction style, when you go buy toothpaste, or you go buy your morning cereal, or you go buy maybe even some of your clothing that is in mass market, you have no relationship, you have no conversation, you have no input into the people who have designed it, manufactured it, produced it, shipped it, even stacked it in the shelf by the time you consume it. So that means that there's a fundamental disconnect between the person that consumes it and the person that makes it, ships it, or basically produces it. So that means that the entire story of engagement is driven through brand-based promise. And the relationship that you create and the data that is created around that is mostly driven around sales. Because you don't have an engagement, you can't really go and talk to somebody about, like say you want to talk to somebody, at Colgate and say to him, why did you put the blue and the white and the red in the toothpaste? I don't want any blue, please. There's no option. There's no ways that you can actually do that because the relationship is entirely remote. So that means recommenders that's going to engage with people purely based on brand-based options. The final measure is the sale. When you move to customer, the construct is that I get to know a little bit about you. I know your name, your address. I might know some of your preferences, and I've got no other insights about you. I've had no ability to converse with you. So if you have to think about when you go to your retail bank, or maybe even your telco company, or anybody that is maybe a mass market service provider, and you go open up an account, it is not in their financial interest to ask you what your challenges are, or to invest any effort in you, because it's too costly. There are humans in the system that are just too costly to service when you want to collect information about a person. So that means a customer relationship or customer centricity is for me to get some insight from you, a little bit of data from you, or whatever is cost effective, and then segment it. And when you get to client, it's when you have a deep relationship. So if you had to go to your doctor or your private banker or your lawyer or whatever it is, the only way that they can service you is by you telling them what it is that is of interest to you, or you asking them a question and them interpreting your situation and giving you a response back. So we kind of could see that in a digital track. If you look at the second track in this chart, the concept of sales and the way in which you make money based on the recommendations that you make, if it's a consumer, is really the only measure that most companies have. What if you could track what time of the day, under what conditions, what people normally buy together, what the basket looks like, all the other data points, how much more value you will have from that engagement if you only had a consumer relationship and you can turn it into a client relationship. As part of your engagement, you can provide a recommendation and ask 1 or 2 questions at a time and the responses sets the context for the next recommender or the next experiment that you are running to make sure that you truly get to know that community. So that means it could be quite transformative. In the customer space, because it's so costly to service a lot of these customers, that means that recommenders that are designed just for you, so that means that from your menu items, the color in the background of your web or your app, the options that are available to you, because you are more engaging in the customer kind of space, it means that the engagement now becomes far more important because it's beyond transactional. It's far more engaging and bi-directional, and it's basically a conversation. And then when you get to the client space, a lot of what you do, and if you had to think of this as a situation, when you go buy toothpaste, you don't have a conversation with a shopkeeper to ask them the best way to use the toothbrush with that particular product in that situation, because you know that they know nothing about it. They're purely representing a particular brand or a product. But when you go to your dentist or you go to your doctor, you will have unstructured conversations. And in the unstructured conversation, there will be an interpretation of who you are and what you do. And that interpretation is completely undocumented. So could the Holy Grail be, and this is kind of the question, could the Holy Grail be if you could establish experiments and recommendations that can take a consumer or a customer and turn them into a client? And that means that continuously learn about their preferences, about the things that they are interested in, and feed off that to make sure that you make the exact correct recommendation or totally incorrect recommendation in order to determine what the person really wants and don't want. Okay, so what I thought maybe what would be worthwhile, Eric, if we work through the recommendation side, it might just be worthwhile to show everybody what kind of the recommenders are, and we can talk about how they can be applied and then make today conversational. So I don't know if anybody has got any specific questions about recommenders before we start.
When do you use a recommender? Why would you use a recommender?
Realistically, anything that you engage with another human on can be impacted by a recommender. So that's the simple answer to it. So I think that, you know, it might be worthwhile just to work through all of those options.
I see there's another question. So just before I go in, what do you mean by a hybrid recommender?
Oh, the different types of recommenders. I think almost all of what we recommend, if you had to look at classical recommendation theory, are hybrid based. We don't think that you should only ever use one style. That means that you almost always going to use, and you're going to see that there will be a paper published sometime in the next few weeks that will outline some of the classical theory in context of how we see hybrids, because almost all of the way in which we do it is cold start, model driven, rather than just the old style of, if you had to think of like a collaborative based approach or anything. So if you look at it here, if you had to think of the kind of classical paradigms that exist in kind of recommender systems based design, is that you have content based, collaborative filtering, hybrid based methods. And I think that most of these original concepts were designed based on lookup and matrix-based methods. Not a lot of those methods use deep learning capabilities or any of the learning capabilities that we've been promoting in our kind of style of trying to solve some of these problems. So that means that if you take the collaborative-based filtering problem, and you normally have the user or the customer, you have the product, and you have a combination of how those kind of going to be used. Because if you have a customer-driven approach, it means that the customer sets the scene for what a recommendation preference will be driven by. If it's a product-driven approach, it means that the product will set the prioritization, and the combination of those that creates the actual recommendation and the response to what has been recommended is the transaction that gets created. So that means that the content-based filtering methods and other approaches have been designed to solve some of those problems. But the hybrid seems to be the one that makes the biggest impact, because you want to set up adversarial approaches out of the box without having to worry about the technology or the configuration complexities when you set up these in different kind of situations. So if you then look at the user-driven approach, if you know that a certain category of user or a certain style of engagement will provide a certain kind of preference. You want to be able to have a model that can converge on that capabilities. And if you don't have an understanding of how it's going to converge, you want to be able to set an experimentation or a dynamic experiment in motion through experimentation that will go and figure out the most optimal approach to solve the problem based on your exploit criteria. Because if your criteria for the recommender is maximum engagement, because you want to drive customer satisfaction and long-term value, and let's say sales is not your initial measure, you probably will end up configuring your recommender differently than if you want to do maximum exploitation and you do not care about the longevity or customer lifetime value. So we're kind of seeing that you need a flexible approach where you want to be able to figure out what these preferences are and the native changes over time. So we use graph theory and other methods to measure this alongside cold start and your dynamic recommendations that use combinations of approaches and learning model-based approaches. Because we have, in some cases, implementations where you have a binomial and multinomial combination set of models that fit within a single recommender, and the recommender has got a model that is trained per product, but you could also have a model that gets trained per client. And you need a technological infrastructure to deal with that. And that's kind of really for us the big part of how we're trying to solve this, so that you can have maximum flexibility when you set up the different approaches to get to that ultimate, customer engagement, whatever it might be that you want to get to. You want to make sure that you know that you got to the right place. So that means that having a staged approach, contextual-based recommenders that one can provide input to another, because maybe you don't know which approach is or would be the most appropriate for the situation that you're moving into. And you maybe want to add a calendar or a time-based dependency so that you can then adjust manually what you do or do it quite flexibly so that you can move from one style of recommendation to another. And you want the engine to take care of all of those base constructs for you. You don't want to go into and decide that it's only one style versus another. You want a combination of styles that must all come together. And we find that classically using, let's say, this collaborative-based approaches, that is the original construct because it's purely matrix-based approaches. In the learning, when you add multiple dimensions, you almost indefinitely would end up working with model where you've got hundreds of features that will determine what the dimensions are. You don't sit with just 2, 3, 4 dimensions. You now sit with thousands of dimensions, depending on what kind of behavior you would want to measure over time. So that means that getting to a point where you can really determine, so let's say, purchase probabilities, you do not want to be dependent on time situations, engagement styles, digital front end and usage capabilities, interaction actions, steps that they follow to get to the point where they buy. If it's a user-driven approach or a product-driven approach, you want to be able to use all of it. And you want an adversarial approach and experimentation to figure out which one is the best for you. So the idea is not to pick out of the box the recommender, but to pick the experiment and the purpose of what you will be measuring from a business value point of view, then figuring out later on what the real mechanism is that is the best. So that means that you need a technology that supports a multitude of different approaches, so you can figure out what the best method is by the time you go and you kind of get it implemented. Anyway, I just thought it might be worthwhile just to show that it's a bit more context for the people who are quite familiar with the original kind of recommender theories that sit behind the scenes. I'm just looking at the comments. Recency, frequency, monetary to segment customers before recommender systems. You could do a multitude of those. We find that clients use various styles of recommendations. We use anything from neuro-linguistic, other kind of methods of clustering. You can use, definitely can use, ongoing frequency of interaction, and you can set a multitude of those parameters when you set up what's known as a dynamic recommender. You can decide how you set up a combination of those measures when you configure it. So what might be worthwhile is let Eric talk you through, and then we can kind of, just interact to talk about what we have got configured as kind of the basis of just the existing recommender module, and then we can then show you what the options are, and we can then go into detail as we work through each one of those, just so you guys can kind of see the portfolio view. Okay.
So I think what's maybe useful is to kind of, instead of just picking one thing and digging down into all the detail, kind of going through it in layers. So starting at the highest level and then sort of going one level down with each of the different types of recommenders. And Jay's spoken about a lot of them, but we can just go, and Jay, if you have anything to contribute while I'm going through it, please go ahead. So I think the one kind of basic type of offer recommender that people often implement is something that is just based on historical data and uses a single model to recommend one of multiple options. So whether that's menu items or an offer to make to people or design construct or whatever it is, you basically take one big data set, build one big model, and you'll train your model on your one big data set and deploy that. And there's often kind of additional functionality you need to build around that to make it useful. If you want to rank things by some sort of profitability metric or a range of things like that. But at the core of the recommender piece, that's the way that one of them can work. The second one, which I think is often more effective, and Jay was mentioning it earlier, is instead of building one model for everything, you build a separate model for each option that you're looking to recommend. So if we're talking about offers to make to people, you might be giving either 10% off or a month free or something else. You would build 3 different models, one for each of those instead of one model for all 3. That allows you more flexibility in how you structure your data sets and how you put things together, and can often give more effective results than the single model approach. I mean, when Jay was talking about having the technology to enable you to try different things, I think one of the reasons people often don't do this is, I was talking about 3 options and that sounds fine, but generally there's far more than that. So if you have even sort of 10, 20, up to hundreds of different things that you're choosing between, one, how do you actually sort of train all of those models? But more importantly, how do you implement? Implementing one model in production is hard enough. Like, how do you implement hundreds of them in a way that still performs at a high speed and is reliable and all of those sort of things? The next piece is, what if you don't have that kind of historical data set, or you have a much more limited historical data set? So that's kind of more of the cold start problem. And, how do you have a recommender that has more of a experiment ideology or approach to it? So you're not saying we're just going to take this historical data and based on what it tells us, we're going to make recommendations. Like, how do you set things up so that it will learn from your customer interactions and use information that you have available, but mainly base its recommendations on how people are actually behaving now?
So Eric?
Yeah, go ahead.
I can just give some context. For those who are from kind of the marketing theory space, if you look at Ansar's model around how you address markets, and you had to think of, on a one end, how you're going to address your market, the other end, the kind of product that you use, and you've got existing market, existing product. Your style of configuring that would be that you understand based on your priors how people have engaged, and you could probably get away with using fairly traditional recommender systems. But as soon as you get into the new space, and let's say that you got a new product in an existing market, you don't have priors, but you have an understanding as to how the customer has behaved historically. So the customer probably becomes the driver in the context of the launch, because you want to be able to understand what are the novelty-based drivers, what are the interests of the customers that have responded to new recommendations rather than ones that are available to them currently. So if you want to launch a new product, but if you go into a new market with an existing product, you probably will take your historical behavior of how you've launched products, what has happened in the context of that particular launch, and you'll have a slightly different dimension. So the idea is that when you set up experiments, you can decide if you want to use any priors or some priors, the way that Eric described it now. So you can use, if it fits within your ANSOP strategy, you can then see, well, if it is something that is new market, new product, as you know, very difficult. You sit with a cold start problem unless your product is homogeneous and you're very narrowly focused on a certain market or a certain channel. So this gives you an opportunity to configure experiments to deal with anything that is away from what you normally used to do or what the norm was of your historical based interactions. It allows you some way to do that. So you can do it within, a multitude of those configurations. Eric, I just thought of your context.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. The other thing that it helps you with as well is if your environment is changing over, which can often be the case. So whether that's through seasonality or just sort of shifts in behavior through kind of events like, COVID or Ukraine, or even smaller things like, load shedding, or it gets cold, or whatever it is, human behavior is impacted by the environment. So using something that leans more heavily on how are people interacting with it now rather than your historical data set can be more effective in that case. The next couple are kind of in a sort of follow that experimentation framework, but more based on kind of, changing the interface and how you would interact with people. So, what messages would you send to someone? Look, even if you know what you want to say, like, how would you say it? Because that can have a big impact on how people behave. The next piece that's kind of something useful to think about in terms of like how you want to do your recommender, which Jay also mentioned, is, we were talking here, the offer recommender multi-model, about having a model per option. You can actually go down to the space of having a model per customer. So whether that's in the experiment or the more experimental sort of framework or the more historical model-based framework, it can be quite an effective approach to have a model per customer, particularly if, the main requirement is you need to have fairly regular interactions with those customers. And this is one of those things where it's useful to, again, think about the fact that, you can kind of combine all of these approaches. So, you could use your model per customer for people who interact with you regularly, and use a broader model for people who come in once in a while. But that model per customer, because you are learning specifically based on someone's interactions and preferences, as long as you have enough data from them, there's less noise from the rest of the environment. You don't have to be like, other people who had this characteristic, effectively other people who had this characteristic also behave this way. Get a bit, how did this person behave? So that can be quite effective. So the other, talking about, combining, in that case of, maybe you have a customer level model and a more general model, you can also think about combining the like historical database approach with the more experimental approach. So the most basic form of that is you basically set aside a proportion of your interactions and say those are going to be at random. And you use that to make sure that you're still kind of exploring the environment and seeing what's going on. And so say you do 10% random and 90% based on the model. And then, you can move up to doing more sophisticated approaches based on, kind of looking at how uncertain you are about different options or places, like areas in the environment that you're working in, and maybe focusing on places with higher uncertainty while also using kind of more of a model-based approach to see what could be the best recommendation to make to a specific person.
But yeah, I mean, I was kind of curious as to what kind of a circumstance that would work well in, and to use a very common, or at least a very well-known and rather successful set of recommenders. Like, would Spotify use, for example, a multiple, or would it just be based on models that there's various numbers of them?
Jess, can I maybe just give a quick comment, and then Eric, if you could maybe then give some detail, but let's just think about for a moment different styles, and maybe as an example, let's just look at 3 styles of recommenders. The one is when you have a few customers, or relatively speaking, a few customers that have got many options. The next one is when you have many customers that only have a few options. And then you have one where you've got many customers with many options. So if you look at the first one, and you've got a few customers with many options, it's typically when you have like specialized retail, or anything that's got to do with, if you had to go buy like 3D printers or whatever it might be, or whatever it might be. So that means that there could be a few hundred options to buy, but that the market is fairly selective or fairly small. The recommender has to then understand a lot more about the product preferences than what it would about the customer itself, because the customer might only ever come in once to buy something and never buy it again, especially if you had to think of like many options where the price is fairly high. That means that if the customer's only engaging with you once, and they're only going to come back in a year from now, there's no continuous understanding of their behavior. It's very different than if you had to think of, let's just have a look at banking, telcos, insurance, or anything in the kind of financial services sector for a moment. You've got a fairly large number of clients who engage with you continuously, and whose product preferences are normally fairly narrow. So that means if you have somebody, how many times do you open up a credit card with the same bank? How many times do you open up a savings account? How many times? So that means that what you find now is that your recommender shifts its behavior almost entirely. And that's why a lot of the classical, if you think of this collaborative filtering and so on, methods just don't work, because you need to have far more of an understanding as to how you're going to activate the client, because your revenue and what you're trying to achieve with the recommender is to get a person to be more active. So take as an example, not to sell them another current account or another credit card, but to get them to spend more with the existing credit card. So that's why you then go for an approach that will be customer-driven model, like the one Eric showed now, that's got messages, and you might then have a multi-stacked approach from a recommender point of view to say, I want to determine your mood before I recommend for you to go buy something. So if your mood's not right, should I recommend for you to go to the spa, or should I recommend for you to go buy food? You know what I mean? So that means that continuous engagement then changes how you then engage. If we then have many to many, that's the Spotify scenario. So that means that if you then understand, let's just say that you've never been on Spotify or on a music channel like that, and there are 40 million titles and there are 40 million customers. How are you going to pick from 40 million options which ones are the best for you? So what you attempt to do is to test with a person or the user signing up with you about some contextual preferences first. That's why you set what's known as a contextual variable, and we can show you later how you do that. When you set a contextual variable, you narrow it down based on what that person thinks they know about themselves. But as you know, in computational social science, we've now proven over and over again what people say and what they do have got nothing to do with each other. So that means that you're going to then pick something that is exactly what they ask for, but only for some of the time. But now let's just say that let's say you say you only want to listen to 80s, and we recommend only 80s music, and you listen and then you stop listening. What you still want to do is then recommend rock jazz, R&B, and get further and further away from people that normally listen to that kind of music. And let's just say that you start liking and listening to music that is far removed from your initial preferences. It opens up the options for you. So that means that it's going to keep on sending you content or recommending something to you that's based on the fact that you prefer higher degrees of novelty. But if you're the person who only ever listens to one genre, one style within one context, you will then make sure that you narrow it down a little bit. You will only say 5% of the time, or maybe even 2% of the time, recommend something that is far removed from the main tunnel of what the person normally will. And also means that if the person is not interested in novelty, you might recommend something that they've already listened to a month ago. Because as you know, in media, nostalgia is an enormously important property to measure. Because people listen and get excited by actions on nostalgia. But when you use your bank account, and I want to recommend for you to spend money, not many people get nostalgic about putting in fuel in a motor car. So that means that you need a different style of thinking about how you would configure that.
But I mean, surely, so I'm just listening to it now, surely there could be some level of overlap between those two, or at least a small amount of inspiration that's taken from that Spotify scenario. So let's say you are not necessarily relatively new to having a bank account, because often you'll have teenagers or kids that already have bank accounts, but you're relatively new to the whole banking scenario. You're relatively new to actually making enough money to then interact within that world. So for the very first time you come into the app, you actually only select, like you would with Spotify, you select a few things about what you think you want. So what you think you want when you recently come into it is, I need somewhere to put my salary, and I need to be able to withdraw money from that salary or do EFTs. Okay, cool. So then you've got a really limited amount of things within that space that you can interact with. Yeah. And then slowly, as you learn, you begin to request more information from that. So, yes. I mean, I'm just thinking about really complicated apps out there where you suddenly have a bank account or an app for the very first time, and you're getting information about home loans and about car loans and about all manner of really complicated banking stuff that hasn't even entered within your realm yet. I mean, could there be some kind of an inspiration from that Spotify idea and put into a banking environment, for example?
Listen, I definitely think that if you had to think of it in kind of two dimensions, the one dimension is what you would be interested in being recommended. So whatever the item is, it's going to come to you. And the other one is the means that you use to get there in the first place. So that means that if you're a person, if you think about something like checking balances on accounts, bank accounts or telcos and so on, it is habitual today. So people will go look at it without ever kind of, I mean, you'll probably know that there's not going to be a change in your balance, but people check it anyway. So the question is, if you're an inbound based, or if there's an inbound based call where somebody is going to want to check something, what would the recommendation look like than if it's outbound? And I think a lot of recommended designs forget about that. They forget about the fact that if I'm going to engage with you cold, and I need to know the time of the day, the kind of things I'm going to say, and how I'm going to drag you into a conversation by context and setting multiple contexts so that it would look like you are contributing to something that will be highly specific to you, because I am doing it to you. So that means it's kind of a one-to-many relationship. But if you come to me and you are about to check your balance, the moment you check that, the recommender needs to know that people that have got this much money in the bank and perform this kind of behavior, normally buy these kind of products over this kind of time, normally have all these interactions. And that's why you can't use classical recommender systems for that. You need a complex behavioral model that will then know that this person would want to act on the following capability. So the question then, Esther, is if you already, let's take a banking example. If you're already totally banked, what do I recommend to you? All I can recommend to you then is something that sits on the periphery of what you do. Mr. Customer, can you recommend customers to come to the bank? And if you recommend those customers to come to the bank, I will incentivize you. So then you use the network effect. But the recommender needs to know that I have already satisfied. There's no point recommending to me yet another credit card, yet another, and that's what often happens. People use historical data that lasts forever, and you need to be fresh and know high, especially if it's inbound. So I definitely think you need to think about it in both directions. And it's the same thing when you think about music. If Spotify, let's take the Spotify example. If Spotify had to spam you with music and they know nothing about you, or even if you have an account and you haven't used it for a year, what is it going to recommend you if it knows that there are about 1 million titles that might relate to the things that you like normally?
It'll recommend the most popular thing, right?
That's it. So you take the exploitative view, because whatever is popular sells. And you think about the long tail, Chris Anderson's long tail kind of discussion in retail, that's exactly what happens. You take the things that is the most popular with the highest impact that most people should like, and you forget about the fact that the ones who can have highly specific things just for them kind of then they kind of get forgotten. Yeah.
I think the other thing to think about in your example about banking, and I guess in general, is, that you don't always have to have your recommenders having a direct financial impact. So this is, it goes back to Rob's thing of what can you recommend? You can actually, your recommender can be determining what the navigation layout of your banking app looks like. Or, something that we looked at for one of our clients is, what can you tell after someone's first click where they're trying to get to in the app? So if you have a complicated app, you should actually just design your app better as a long-term solution. But if you have something complicated where it takes 7 or 8 clicks to get anywhere, if you can probably tell based on who someone is and the context, and, if they have this habitual thing that they wake up and check their balance every morning, when someone logs into the app, it should say, hey, do you want to check your balance, or your balance is this much. And that doesn't directly get them to do anything that makes you money, but it improves their customer experience and makes them loyal, and there will be indirect benefits. And I think, on your point of, when someone's new to the financial system, what do you show them and stuff, actually an interesting example I've always thought is, I don't know if it's still the case because I haven't checked for a last while, but for years Capitec had the highest rated banking app in the country, and it had by far the least functionality.
Okay, so just for context for everybody, it's a South African bank that is rated in a world context as one of the top banks in the world for client engagement in the mass market.
Yeah,
a bank called Capitec Bank.
Yeah. So they had a fraction of the functionality of everyone else. They definitely didn't do it better. I got a Capitec app just so that I could take a look at what they were doing and how they were doing it. But there's so much stuff that you do with your bank that when you actually say, cool, I'm going to have this banking app with full functionality, which sounds great, it ends up just getting into that situation of, okay, cool, I need to get through 7 clicks before I'm going to do anything, because I first need to go into the right product and then the right section of that product and the right subsection and do this. And, whereas Capitec was you could only do 4 things. So there were 4 buttons on the front page, and everyone was like, oh, this app is amazing, because they only built the 4 things that people used the most. But I think using recommenders, there is a middle ground where you can have that Capitec experience, but on an app with full functionality. And then if you do want to do something that is out of the norm or is not one of the top 4 things, then ideally it can be picked up immediately. So, you've seen that there's if the bank registers a declined payment on someone's card or a bounced debit order or something, when they log into the app, you should have a specific navigation to that to help them get to it and resolve it, and that's a very basic example. That's not even really a recommender so much as just a rule, but you can see how you could have recommenders that would improve your customer experience and give you kind of that Capitec, everything I want to do is just here experience, even though there's actually a lot of functionality available. You complexity, especially, and part of that would be, how familiar is this person with the financial system?
Yes.
Do we want to like have the fact that they can open a share trading account like on the front page navigation? Like probably not, because they're never going to do it. Like let's rather use that space for, I don't know, the recent salary deposit, because they don't actually know when they get paid and that they're getting paid and all that sort of stuff. So yeah.
So ultimately, I mean, because that's exactly what I was thinking of. I mean, I did have the Capitec example in mind as well, but also just sort of, like you were saying now, I mean, it is something that can be applied to more than just banking, to have this process of learning a small bit at a time. And those recommenders choose the right opportunity to not just constantly try to sell you something or give you something or get you roped into something, but to actually recommend a small piece of information that says to you, did you know that with a bank, you can do this thing and this is how this thing works? Would you like to know more about it? And so then maybe you select yes, and then you kind of go down a pathway and you drop off halfway through and the bank goes, or the recommender will know, okay, cool, well, don't mention this again for a little while because clearly they got overwhelmed. Or then, you know, a week down the line, you actually then recommend the widget for that thing. So I can't even remember the example that you used just now, but instead of having that little widget on your app permanently there, it's hidden in the background. And only when you choose to say, yes, I want to know more about this thing, or I want to actually interact with this thing, that's when it pops up. So you don't have this cluttered environment.
So Jesse, here's an example. I don't have a Capitec account with my Chase Bank account, all right? So if you think of like your credit journey as the anchor of all of what you do, a lot of the recommendations around what you have access to is around your credit score. So you set your context and what's known as your eligibility rules based on your credit score. And then you provide specifically based on your credit score, a recommendation for additional credit or other kind of products that you then can pitch to the customer. The other recommendation sits around your rewards. So the rewards recommendations, in this context, if I just look at my rewards recommendations, it's called ultimate rewards. It knows that I've got a certain amount of points that I haven't spent. Obviously for the bank, that sits on the balance sheet as a risk, the fact that you haven't spent your points, and they want you to do that. And it says that you can either cash in your points to these accounts or you can go spend it over there. So it then recommends to you what kind of services or products you can purchase. And then it's got right at the bottom generic offers. And the generic offers are either product or service. So you can say that I want to go to a movie, go to watch a particular band, in this case in New York, but my account's originally from kind of New York, Manhattan. So you can go watch a band. And if you select this, you can fulfill it directly through the payment system that sits inside the banking app. So that means that ability to conglomerate and to have this multitude of contexts fundamentally push you away from historical recommender systems, because it has got to do with different eligibility rules and context. It's nothing to do with, and I know there was a question earlier around like the RFM model. You know, if you had to do pre-segmentation on, even if we do this, had to look at like recency, right? The elapsed time of a customer's last transaction with a brand and all the sort of generic activity that normally happens. In banking, you don't have those classical measures that you would apply that if you had somebody that has got a singular brand app like a Nike or an Apple. So that means that it's about digital interactions. The purpose of you going to the digital channel is not to go to the channel. It's to perform a certain action or to observe information. Two things that you normally want to do when you interact. So that means that your recommender can use your digital personality as the output of your recency. If you look at frequency and you want to be able to look at how frequent somebody engages with you, there's people that, like we said earlier, highly frequent and some that don't do it frequently at all. You know, so you need to decide based on your brand what that means. I remember we used the spousal dynamic model to get to that equilibrium, you know, and sentimental equilibrium will tell you the point at which if people don't come to you, they've forgotten about you. And if they don't interact with you, they're not going to be that important. And then the monetary value. How do you determine the monetary value in banking? You can't. So for retail, yes, that works well generically. Maybe even for media, if you sell point-based media solutions, if you had to go and rent a movie at a time, you can use those kind of measures. But most pay TV measures today don't use any of those theoretical constructs because they know that it's continuous engagement, and most of the interactions have got to do with that highly contextual behavioral intervention. It is not just about the generics of how these things work. But I think that the point with a bank, like with Chase Bank, and if I just look at my offers, I'm not sure if these are always that relevant to me. I'll probably need to go talk to them about fixing some of these things, because it's given me 23, of those where it says that I probably need something from, Old Navy and Sealy, and I need to go to, CVS. Maybe that's right. Yeah, if I get a headache. But the thing is that there are a couple of recommendations, and what it does, it's got a partnership, and it tells you the urgency of when you need to do it. So that offer is only valid for 4 days, so it gets cached. So that means that you need to be able to cache that if you wanted to do that kind of configuration yourself. Anyway, that was just an example of something that's, more like international bank.
Yeah, it's been a very fantastic topic to discuss, and it's like you guys have just scratched the surface. There's some interesting questions. I'm going to open the floor up for a last round of questions. Type them in the chat. We'll just ask your question.
Could I just make one last comment? I forgot to mention it earlier. I was just looking at my recommendations here, and because that's a construct that we often talk about, and it's called the time, the place, and the act. Because what happens when you make a recommendation, and the recommendation has got to do with an abstract product that is digital, it's devoid of location, and so often devoid of time. But if I'm going to make a recommendation for you to go to a hairdresser, to go to a movie house, to go to a restaurant, or to attend whatever it is that is hyperlocal, you need to have your contextual dimensions set across the different vectors that you're going to use to drive your recommendation. So there's no point for me recommending for you to go to the hairdresser at 10 o'clock at night when you know that the store is closed. So you need to know the time and the place and how it will be consumed. And the act is, how do I get you along a journey to the point where I know that you're going to engage with what I'm getting you to be exposed to. Anyway, I just wanted to make that as kind of one of the comments around location specifics, if you include that in your measures.
Thanks, Jay. Anybody else with questions? I don't see anything else in the chat. As per usual, we'll stay online for any questions you want offline or off the main chat. Next week, do we have a topic for next week, Jess?
Of course we do. Next week, we are talking about the 5 factors of experimentation, actually. So it will definitely lead on from today's session quite nicely. So talking about what's important, why experimentation is important, and what are the 5 main things to look at when designing these experiments or theorizing them or actually putting them into practice.
Great. Thanks everyone for spending time with us today. Look forward to seeing you next week.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Thanks, Rob.